Okay, well, good morning. I'm glad to be here to present to you knowledge of creation and flood in ancient China. First of all, I want to start out with this quote by Bernard Calgren. Language, literary language, is the greatest artistic creation of a civilized nation. It is not shaped by philologists at their desk, but by giants of thought who have something to say to their contemporaries and who carve their monuments from the solid granite of the spoken language. So today I want to use Chinese characters, the Chinese written language, which are truly monuments of ancient China, to present to you their knowledge of the Genesis record. First of all, Chinese words have been well preserved for a few thousand years, and it's because they are carved onto what is called auricle bones. These are tortoise shells that ancient Chinese used for divination and religious purposes, and this has been found in the late 19th century, and now about 55,000 of these fragments have been documented. And then Chinese characters are also engraved in bronze inscriptions. These date back to the Shang dynasty, to the Han dynasty, and there are about 12,000 copies of this. So the point here is that ancient Chinese characters are well preserved for us, and we can actually see that the evolution of Chinese words are not completely different. You can trace it back, and there is a continuation. So even the modern form can be traced back to the ancient form, as in this word for tiger. The other thing that I want to present at the beginning is that Chinese written characters were developed independently of the written language of the Near East. This is important. That means in ancient times, the Chinese and the Middle Eastern people did not have interactions. But what I'm going to present show you that they have a common knowledge of what happened during the time of Genesis. Now, Chinese characters is an iconic language. It's a graphic language. In fact, many ancient languages started out graphic, but then it evolves into phonetic for the simple reason that phonetic language is easier to memorize and to repeat and to write. Chinese is the only language in the world that retained its graphic form for a few thousand years. In the early 60s, Chairman Mao wanted to simplify the written language. He introduced the phonetic form, which is called pinyin, but it didn't take hold, thankfully. So we still use the pictographic form. And in terms of the graphic interface, there are three major forms of Chinese words. The first are the pictographs. These are words with concrete meaning or concrete shape, such as here you can see the lamb, the tortoise, and the fish. Those are called pictographs. They have concrete ideas. Then the second, which is the largest group of the Chinese characters, are called the ideographs. These are words that carry an idea, because not every word has a concrete shape. So ideas got to be put together in through these pictures to express the embedded idea. Like, for example, here, I will show you that this is a pictograph of a person, as in a person walking. And then when you put a person plus another person, it becomes follow. You can see here, it's a very clear picture. A person after another person means to follow. That is called an ideograph. And then the third group are the phonetics. So this word is pronounced meow, but you add a classifier or what is called a radical, it becomes cat because it is pronounced meow, mao, sorry. So it sounds like the sound of a cat. All right, when it comes to ideogram or ideograph, we need to understand that it conveys an idea. All right, so this is a sign for danger. When you see that sign, you understand it means danger. It doesn't mean that there is a skeleton there, but it simply means if you get near there, you will become like that. All right, the power of the graphic interface or iconic language is this. This is a famous Rosetta Stone. For a few hundred years, the Egyptian language has been lost to the world. When people saw the pictures, the icons on the wall of monuments in Egypt, they had no idea that it was a language until the Rosetta Stone was discovered, along with the ancient Egyptian language and the Greek language, which we still know. So from there, experts are able to decipher the iconic Egyptian language. And they are able to do that because it is an iconic language. So a lot of the words are now known to us. So this is an illustration. When you use an embedded written script, the meaning of the word is embedded. It is there. So these are two very famous symbols. We all know it. Otherwise, we'll be in trouble. On the left is a symbol for a lady's room, and on the right is a symbol for a man's room. Now, these two symbols have taken hold. I would assume that they don't need to be changed. So a few thousand years later, just for the sake of discussion, ladies no longer wear dress or skirt. But when our descendants look at these two icons, which will not change, even though the fashion may change, but the icons do not change, then they will say, you know, maybe our female ancient ancestors wore something that looks like this, a triangle. Okay? So you can see what I mean now by the embedded meaning. They do not change. In other words, this is the amazing thing. By studying and observing Chinese characters, we can get into the minds of ancient Chinese a few thousand years ago. We can know to a certain degree what they knew because of how they designed those words. Now, in order for the words to take hold, such as these two icons, they got to be accepted by a large number of people. Otherwise, other symbols will come around. So this is the other thing, that for some of these characters that I'm going to present to you to take hold, those ideas must have been quite common knowledge. Now, there are those who criticize my interpretation of the Chinese words. They say, oh, they don't mean that. You're just making it up, and it's because you are a Christian. I will tell you that my interpretation is not an independent interpretation. It is supported by other historical facts and historical documents within the Chinese culture. And one of that is the border sacrifice. In the border sacrifice, or during the border sacrifice, many prayers and songs are sung. And these are all very well documented. And this one is from the Ming Dynasty. You will see here, during the ceremony, this song will be played. Of old, in the beginning, there was the great chaos without form and dark. The 5 planets had not begun to revolve, nor the 2 lights to shine. In the midst of it, there existed neither form nor sound. You, O spiritual sovereign, came forth in your sovereignty, and first did separate the impure from the pure. You made heaven, you made earth, you made man. All things became alive with reproducing power. Now, the bottom half is the Chinese original classical version. You will notice that classical Chinese is very succinct. But what I have just read to you is actually an authoritative translation by the late, great James Lake of the 19th century. So from this song, we can tell that ancient Chinese believe in creation. They believe in a creator God. And the Chinese believe God created all things. All the numerous species of living things are indebted to your grace for their beginning. Men and things are all enveloped in your benevolence, O.D. All living things are indebted to your goodness. But who knows from whom his blessings come to him? It is you alone, O Lord, who are the true ancestor of billions and trillions of things. This song is actually carried over many, many centuries, even millennium. So this is the ancient Chinese belief of a creator God. But not just a powerful creative God, a relational God, a God who is interested in having a relationship with his creation. When the Almighty, had so decreed, he called into existence heaven, earth, and man. Between heaven and earth, he separated appointed men and things, but heaven has given me the mandate. Now this was the king, the emperor speaking. So I, a servant of thee, pray for his enlightenment, so may I, a simple person, forever appear before him who is in the highest heaven. Now a side note here, it is very interesting that the ancient Chinese called this supreme being Di, which is a common phoneme for the creator God, as in English word deity or divine. Now, the relationship goes further to the most intimate kind, because the king, the emperor said, you have promised, O Di, to hear us, for you are our father, I, your child. Thou and unenlightened, am unable to show forth my dutiful feelings. I thank you that you have accepted our pronouncement. Honorable is your great name. With reverence we spread out these gems and seals, and as swallows rejoicing in the spring, praise your abundant love. So, what I am about to present in terms of Chinese characters is not independent, it's not a subjective interpretation, it is based on many other supporting documents that we have, such as this. The ancient Chinese believe in a creator God, believe in a God who cares about mankind, and believe in the father-son relationship with God. But the ancient Chinese also knew that mankind is unworthy or sinful. So here it says, the great and lofty one pours out his grace and love. How unworthy are we to receive it? I, his foolish servant. Again, this was the emperor speaking. The emperor of probably the most powerful nation on earth said that he was a foolish servant. All right? This is a great political person admitting his own shortcomings. While I worship, hold this precious cup and praise him, whose years have no end. So out of that, I want to present you the first Chinese word. I want to start with a complex one because I want to show you that this is not something that anybody can make up. This is a Chinese word for righteousness. There are three forms here. The first one is the oracle bone inscription. You'll see that this is a representation of a lamb, and this is a dagger that pierces it, so that righteousness, as the ancient Chinese understood it, comes with a sacrifice, and is a sacrifice of the lamb. And this is a classical form, and on the right is the modern form, the simplified form that is used in mainland China. The classical form is used mostly with Chinese outside of mainland China and Singapore. So you will see this word used in Hong Kong and Taiwan and most overseas Chinese. This classical form has the lamb without the tail, and it is above me. The lower half is me. So a way to understand this ideogram is that righteousness is placing the lamb above me. Another way to put it is that righteousness is when God sees me from above through the Lamb. And this is because of the sacrifice of the Lamb. And then the modern form, which is actually a variation of this word. Again, you remember the icons represent meanings, and there can be variations. And this variation was brought back by Chairman Mao when he simplified Chinese characters. And here you have the symbol of a cup or a chalice, and the dot represents blood. Now again, it is consistent. If you understand this whole idea of sacrifice, the Chinese understood that righteousness comes from a sacrifice represented by the blood, and the cup actually represents the covenantal cup that is used in a sacrifice, especially a covenantal sacrifice. Blood is mixed in together because blood represents life. So it simply means that my life and your life are now intertwined and forever cannot be separated. So the point here is that these three words carry the same meaning at the core of it. So this is not something that anybody can make up. If there is somebody who can give me a better explanation why these three words are so related, I would be very happy to receive it. But more importantly, and a more powerful argument here is that this is a related word, and this word now is sacrifice. Now this is a classical form. Simplified Chinese doesn't look like this, but we are going back to the classical form, and again, there are two variations, but if you recall, this part here is a word for righteousness. And my argument is that righteousness refers or is related to sacrifice. So now you see when this is a classifier or a radical classifies the kind of words. So this is the radical for a bowl. And so when the bowl is added to righteousness, it means sacrifice. So sacrifice has to do with righteousness, or righteousness has to do with sacrifice. And on the right is a variation, and more complicated. That's why it is not so not used very often. But added here is the word xiu, which means beauty or perfection. So the sacrifice that we are talking about is a perfect sacrifice, which I will explain more later. All right, so when you put all this together, my argument stands that this word, the previous word, righteousness, it's intricately related to a sacrifice and a perfect sacrifice. Now again, this is supported by other documents. There was an expectation of a perfect sacrifice. Out of an extra phenomenon, the Chinese interpreters, and during the dynastic days, 14 Chinese astronomers would be scouring and watching the night sky every night. And then they will come up with interpretation of what the extra phenomenon or phenomena mean. Well, actually there were two stars. This one is actually the star from the east. They saw the star from the east, a huge star. And then 13 months later, they saw another star, which I believe is the Star of Bethlehem. If you recall, that when the Magi first started out, they saw the star. But apparently when they got to Jerusalem, the star was no longer around, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have to ask. And the King Herod got to ask him. And this is one of them. About 4 BC, the primary meaning of altar or altar, the key supporting pillar of the heavens, is a perfect sacrifice. So the ancient Chinese had an expectation of a perfect sacrifice. And this perfect sacrifice is called a special sacrifice. This is documented in the Book of Rites, and it describes the kind of animal that is to be sacrificed. This is now, this word te, special, is now made very common. So when you talk about anything special, you use te, as in 特别. But the original use of it has to do with the sacrifice. You may recall that this is a radical for the bull. So the sacrifice that is acceptable has to be a special sacrifice. And replicas of this special sacrifice can be found in the temple of heaven. Has to be pure color, and the horn has to be a certain dimension. It is very important, all right? When the emperor sacrificed, he followed these specifications. Now, not just the word itself refers to sacrifice. The ancient Chinese actually understood substitutionary death or vicarious substitution. During the reign of Shang Tang, the first emperor of the Shang dynasty, this 7-year famine caused a lot of destruction. They did everything to appease the gods. The ministers sacrificed to this and that. Finally, they decided that nothing was working, so they came to the Chinese emperor Shang Tang and they suggested, Emperor, we need to sacrifice a human being in order to please God. Now, China had human sacrifices, but it had never been institutionalized. So the thought that they would officially sacrifice a human being to God was very new. But Shang Tang actually said, okay, we will do that. So they set up a time at a place at the mulberry bush. The emperor said, I will prepare the sacrifice. He came. But to the surprise of the ministers, he shaved himself, he dressed himself, and he offered himself as the sacrifice. And this was a prayer recorded in Chinese history called the Louis Chronicles. This is what he said, I have sinned. The people have no part in it. If, however, the people have sinned, the offenses must also rest upon me. Please do not let one person's lack of virtue cause Shangdi and the spirits to destroy the lives of the people. After Shang Tang prayed this prayer, offering himself, rain came. And he would no longer needed to sacrifice himself. So if you were concerned that he killed himself, he did not. Actually, this is very similar to Moses. Moses also offered to die on behalf of the people, and God did not accept him because he was not qualified. So in the same way, even though Shang Tang had this vicarious understanding or his willingness to die vicariously for the people, God accepted his good intention, but he was not allowed to carry through, and the people were saved nonetheless. So the ancient Chinese, at least Shang Tang, understood that one person can die for the sins of all the people. So, related to that, another extra phenomenon during China's long years of history, summer, 4th month of the year, on the day of Renwu, the imperial edict reads, Yin and Yang have mistakenly switched, and the sun and moon were eclipsed. And then the interpretation, amazing interpretation, the sins of all the people are now on one man. In fact, in another place, a commentary of this event, again, it is recorded in Chinese history, the commentary says that the man from heaven dies, referring to this major eclipse when the earth turned dark for many hours. So this is how the Chinese understood it. And this is recorded around 30 AD, around the time of the eclipse that the Bible recorded on the day of crucifixion. So again, this shows you the ancient Chinese expected one person can die for the rest of the people. Now, we come to a very common word. If you go to a Chinese restaurant, you will have seen this word. This is the most auspicious of all Chinese words. Every Chinese loves this word because it means blessing. Every Chinese wants a blessing. But unfortunately, with most Chinese, they think of blessing as prosperity and well-being. Well-being, yes. Prosperity, maybe not. This is a Chinese word that carries a very spiritual meaning, and it relates to what I shared early on, that ancient Chinese understood that there is a creator God. He wants to have a relationship with us, and he wants a very intimate relationship with us. So first of all, this word, which is often misread, because you see here, this is a radical for that word, and it means to reveal, and it is a radical that stands for God. But as you can see here, this is another radical with only one dot difference. This is a word for clothing. So some Chinese will misinterpret that word to mean clothing, meaning what you wear. But it is not that. So one thing that we can know is that the word that I just showed you is a spiritual word, because it has a radical for to reveal. And from there, I will also postulate that ancient Chinese understood that God is a self-revealing one. Unless he reveals himself, we do not know him. All right. Talking about the relationship, that ancient Chinese understood that God loves the people. Heaven loves the people. The ruler should honor heaven. Classic of history. And Mozi said, how do we know that heaven loves the people of the world? Because he enlightens them universally. God's love is universal. Now, this is very different from your knowledge of Chinese today, who are in idolatry. They do not have a relationship with God. They never know this God or their gods, and they never believe that their idols would love them. Their relationship with the idols is mostly transactional. But whereas in ancient China, the Chinese knows of a very intimate relationship with God, and it is encapsulated in this word for blessing. This part here, which is often misinterpreted by people, first they think that this word here means clothing, and then, of course, this is a word for one, and they misinterpret this word for mouth, and then this is misinterpreted as a field. So they think that happiness means having clothing and having food and a piece of land. That is not the case, because if you go to the Oracle Bone Dictionary, you'll find that it carries this other element, and that this is actually a pictograph, not an ideogram. It is a picture of a jar of wine, and the two elements below are a pair of hands. So the whole thing put together is a pictogram of God, and then human lifting up a jar in worship to him, offering wine to him. So I will interpret blessing to be a dynamic human relationship with this creator God, especially in worship. So blessing comes from having a worshipful relationship with God, because the ancient Chinese understood that the supreme creator deserves to be worshipped. Shangti is revered because his will extends to the 9 limits. That is everywhere. Everywhere we should worship him. Now, moving on, I will show you 2 Chinese words. This is a pictograph of mouth or a person. Like as in English, how many mouths to feed? So this can mean the physical mouth, but also can mean a person. And then this is the Chinese pictograph for a tree. You see here is a ground level, and these are the roots that grows underneath the tree. When you put these 2 words together, the mouth and the tree, suddenly the meaning becomes restraint. I believe this word refers to the Genesis record, that the ancient Chinese, when they think of a word to describe restraint, instead of tying hands together or some other form, they remembered the first restraint placed on man. That was, do not eat from that tree. Now, this is not just some conjecture on my part, because this is supported by our other findings that we have. And the most astounding finding that probably in recent archaeological history is the discovery of the Sanxintui bronze artifacts. Sanxintui was a very large ancient civilization in Sichuan province, but amongst the many artifacts they discover is this bronze tree. It stands 3.95 meter tall, so it's the size of a small life-size tree. And you actually see fruit protected by branches and leaves that look like knives, and it is inhabited by a snake with feet. And there is a human hand reaching out to it. So this is a snake I'm talking about, and 2 front feet. And this, the fruit that are protected. And then finally, there's a hand that is reaching out to touch the tree. So what I just shared about the word for restraint is not an independent interpretation. It is not just out of the blue. It is not an imputation, but it is supported by this other archaeological effects. So the next word relates to that too. This is a Chinese word for forbid. And you see here 2 trees. The Genesis record told us there were 2 specific trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then, this is the word, if you may recall early on, for God. So God, before the 2 trees, reminded the Chinese of to forbid, because that was the first forbiddance or the first restraint that God put on man. The man was forbidden to eat from the tree of life. And then this is the word for a third person, eat, ta. But interestingly, the ancient form is actually a pictograph. It's a pictograph of a snake. So in ancient China, the third person eat and the snake are the same. Somehow the Chinese put that together. Now the modern form, of course, this is still the word for the third person eat, but the modern form added this word for the reptile to make it, to specify it to be snake. But the ancient form, the snake and the third person eat are the same, the non-human person. Okay, and related to the early word, you will recall that 2 trees and God is to forbid, but now 2 trees and this is a pictograph of a woman. When you have 2 trees and a woman, reminded the Chinese of coveting, to desire what one should not have. This is a Chinese word for to covet, tan lan. And this is a Chinese word for sin, right? Genesis account told us that the Satan, the serpent, purpose was to cause humans to sin. And afterwards I'll share with you why he wanted to do that. But sin, as the ancient Chinese understood it, means to contradict, all right? And the top part can mean 4. So to sin is to have 4 contradictions. If you go into the Genesis record, you will find that Adam and the serpent contradicted God in 4 occasions. Contradiction. going in opposite direction. But this one can also mean, the top can also mean a snare. So the contradiction leads to a snare. This is a variant form of sin. It's no longer used, but you can still find it in dictionary. This is an Asian form for the word sin, and it is also very graphic. It relates to the first one. This is the pictograph of a nose, and it means self. And the bottom half is for bitterness. So when self is on top, the result is bitterness, suffering. That is sin. That fully describes sin as we understand it in the Bible. It is really selfishness. And the Genesis record told us that when Adam and Eve sinned, it resulted in death. So the Chinese word for death, see these two mouths and the tree, it means death. So again, the ancient Chinese, when they think of death, the thing that came to their mind was the tree and the two person. And when the ancient Chinese designed a word for naked, now you recall now, this is the radical for clothing. Okay, it has a dot here. And then now, this is a Chinese word for fruit. Naked. Why on earth, what has fruit got to do with nakedness? Nothing. On other occasions. But when the ancient Chinese thought of nakedness, they thought of the Genesis record. Why did Satan tempt Adam and Eve? Some people think of guilt as a feeling, but guilt is actually a condition, and the ancient Chinese understood it. This is a radical for the heart, and on the right is the devil. So guilt, it's letting the devil into your heart, as the ancient Chinese knew. So the devil tempted Adam and Eve because he wanted to occupy their hearts. Remember early on I tell you that God wanted to have an intimate relationship with human, and the ancient Chinese knew that. But Satan wanted to usurp that, wanted to take over that relationship. So he caused men and women to sin. And the result is guilt. It's a condition. It's a condition of having the devil in your heart. The sin not only resulted in that condition, but the sin also resulted in crime, as the Genesis record tells us. This is the Chinese word for the older brother. It pronounced xiong. And this is also pronounced xiong, but now it means violence or murder or crime. What's the relationship? Because the Genesis record tells us that the older brother, Cain, was jealous, and he killed his younger brother, Abel. And in the process, God forgave him and protected him by putting a mark on his forehead. So you see here, the ancient Chinese, when they think of crime or murder, they remembered that Genesis account or that story. Now, when I say Genesis account, I want to specify here that I'm not saying that the ancient Chinese read the Bible, but the ancient Chinese had knowledge of the Genesis events, just like Moses and the Hebrews knew. So the Chinese independently knew of those records. And so when they designed this word for crime, they thought of the first crime and the brother who received pardon and the mark on his forehead. And then finally, when the ancient Chinese designed a word for a big boat, 船, they thought of the ark that carries 8. This is a Chinese character for 8. And remember this word called mouth, 8 person. So is this coincidence that the ancient Chinese, when they thought of that big boat, they thought of Noah's ark that carried 8 persons. Noah, his 3 sons, and their spouses. So I present to you that the ancient Chinese did have a knowledge of the Genesis account independent of Hebrew scripture, because it was, at that time, a worldwide knowledge, and also because the Chinese, like everybody else on earth, were dispersed from the same source. So they carried that knowledge with them, and then when they design words, they use accounts that were familiar to them. And then finally, I go back to this complex word that I presented earlier on. These are not conjectures. These are explanation or interpretation that are supported by other sources. And yeah, supported by the Bible, because the Bible is just as ancient as the history of Chinese written characters. And the fact that they coincide is not surprising to us. The word for righteousness, that means the lamb above me, and it has to do with sacrifice, and it has to do with a special sacrifice. So thank you for your attention. I hope that this has been helpful, and I hope that this will help you have greater confidence in the Bible that you hold in your hand or have not read in a while. Thank you.